So today we're going to be taking a look at how we can edit a photo for a more commercial quality final result. As you can see up on the screen, we have an image of some Tasty Cake holiday cookies, as well as a cup of milk and some cookies spread around. But where it started from the original, we want to see how we can progress the picture to match a stronger quality that can be presented, whether it's in a newspaper, magazine, online ad, or certain social media. But it takes some time to get in through the process of tweaking out the images to match. If we look at the original image started with a lot of different variations. We can see that the cookies themselves are a lot more pale than the picture that we see in the actual container. We don't even have a glass of milk within the image, but there are a lot of areas that we need to clean up to make it more presentable. And it is a tedious process, but understanding the tools in Photoshop that will allow us to get relatively to what the final result was, cleaning up all the spots, eliminating out the additional cookies, adding in the glass of milk, or adding in the cookies into the container themselves will help give us a result that is a little bit more professional. So to do this, we're going to break it down from the beginning. And before I do get into breaking it down step by step, please understand that I did have several different layers. If we take a look at my layers panel, of different levels of modifying out the cookies until I got the correct result. So if I go back to where I started with the original cookie, we can see that they are a lot more pale. But each time I went into trying to enhance the cookies themselves, eliminating out the background pieces, darkening them up even more, then getting into adding in the shadows or adding in the cookies on the top. This process will eventually slowly build into the final result that you're looking for. But again, it's a matter of first grasping and understanding that it is going to be tedious little elements that make the final result for you. So again, going from the light pale cookies, darkening them up, adding in a couple little details. We'll talk about using the spot healing brush, darkening them up more, and then getting into the shadows and effects to make your presentation a little bit stronger. And that's where we'll start and begin to build out our own final result. So to start out, we have the original image. And the first big thing that I notice, obviously, is the cookies in the foreground. I do want to darken these up, maintaining the background as what it was, but looking to modify the cookies that we currently have. A number of the cookies that we will also look to eliminate just because they become more of a distraction, we will get into eliminating momentarily. But the first thing I like to do is duplicate out the background layer. It just allows to kind of protect the original image. That way, if we do mess up, we can always go back. First, I'm going to look to select out the cookies that I definitely will be maintaining within the design. The fastest way to select out the cookies with some accuracy is using the quick selection tool. Quick selection tool, I'm going to click and drag over the cookies that I want to keep. And if it does select an area that you don't want, hold down Alt, Alt, or Option on a Mac. And I can click and drag over the area that I want to eliminate. So we see that we're not getting the container selected. And then again, just let go of Alt or Option. Now we're going to again just click and drag into the other cookies, making sure that they get selected. And Photoshop does a great job of recognizing the objects that we have versus the objects that are separating from the background. And just taking a look at all these objects, these work overall. So I have the selection. If I do want to add in this piece for right now, I'm just going to add this piece, but I will likely get rid of this cookie as well, just because it becomes a distraction. So with these cookies selected, it's about experimentation. So we have to go into our top navigation, I'm going to go up to first, just take a look to see how it's going to affect with comes the auto tone, auto contrast, or auto color. It made the spots more vibrant on the cookies, but it also made them a lot lighter. I can take a look at auto contrast. That gets it a little bit more punch, which I don't mind. I'll keep that. I can take a look at the auto color itself. That grays it out, so I can hit Command or Control Z to undo. But what I really do know is I'm going to look to darken these up. Give them its burn like we put them back in the oven. So the first thing we can take a look at is getting into exposure itself. So I'm going to go Image Adjustments, Exposure. Just seeing how the exposure is going to be affected. I can darken up the images overall, or take a look at the offset. The offset gives us this brown color, but I don't want to go too low with the exposure. So I'm going to put that back to what it was. But with the offset, you can see that I'm getting more of that darker tone, but it's not necessarily matching just yet overall to the cookies that we have in the image here. So I'm going to set this for right now about -0.1 and click OK. Now we're going to get more of this brown tone or golden color. So I'm going to go back up to Image Adjustments. This time I'm going to take a look at either hue and saturation, or for the first one, I'm going to take a look at photo filter. Photo filter, I'm looking to bring in this yellow color. This yellow color will get a little bit closer to what we're looking for off of these. If I wanted to adjust on my density, you can see how the color is going to change. If I drop it down, where it comes off a little bit more green and pale, I'm bringing up more yellow so it's matching better to that golden brown color that we have there. So about 35% for right now. And again, it's just going to be tedious little tweaks to make it as accurate as possible. This time I'm going to take a look at my vibrance and saturation. With the vibrance and saturation, just adjusting to see how it's going to affect. This makes it more yellow, a lot more actually, which isn't bad overall, but it's not necessarily getting the brownish color that we're looking for. Whereas if I adjust on the saturation, then we start to get really into this yellow color a lot more vividly. But it's a little bit too saturated, so I'm going to pull it a little bit down. Back up to Image Adjustments. This time I'm going to take a look at brightness and contrast. With brightness and contrast, the brightness we don't want to push up necessarily, but taking a look at it down, we get a little bit darker cookie. We start to get more towards what we have in the image itself. I still want to have some contrast. I don't want to become too dull. So I'm going to look to punch up my contrast a little bit up higher. Again, you're just trying to tweak it till you get the colors that you are satisfied with. One element I don't necessarily like is that these cookies are missing a lot of the spots that you see in the original cookies on the image. So in a moment, we're going to take a look at how we can enhance these a little bit more. But again, I'm just going to try tweaking to see if I can get a little bit more brown color. So I'm going to go back up to Image Adjustments, this time Hue and Saturation. With Hue and Saturation, I'm going to modify my hue. See if I can bring out a little bit more yellowish color in them. And you just have to be careful not to get too pink or reddish. And then saturation pulling up just a little bit more. Now we really start to get closer to the original images from the ones in the actual container. So just to deselect, we can see the difference, or see now that with them off selected, in comparison to the cookies that we have in the foreground, they're a lot more pale, have this little bluish green tint to them. These have a lot more rich yellow color to them. Looks a little bit more cooked. But again, like I mentioned before, the spots in here make these cookies look appetizing. The spots that we have on these don't really say that same thing. So we're going to look to see how we can bring in a couple of elements that we see from these spots and bring them onto these cookies. What I'm going to go over to is the spot healing brush tool. Excuse me. We're actually going to go over to the healing brush tool. With the healing brush tool, I can sample certain features. If I want to sample a feature, I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard. And with Alt or Option, I can sample a specific section, say these little green and white or red spots. And what I'm looking to do is paste a couple of these green and white spots onto other cookies. Understand that if I want to pick out a new selection, something that looks more to the angle of the cookie that I'm on, I'm just going to increase the size of my brush, right bracket or left bracket. Can make my brush bigger, but I'm going to hold down Alt to sample again. And now when I go over to one of these cookies, I look for kind of the pale areas. When I start to click, we start to add in a couple more of these speckles. I can shrink down the brush size just so I'm not going too big or covering up too much. Just be careful not to necessarily cover up lighter areas with darker areas itself. I can take a look at the top navigation, try changing to normal so it doesn't replace it entirely, and it will match better to the shape. If it doesn't match or if it doesn't replicate how you're looking for, just hit Control or Command Z. You can see there's these little speckles help to add into the overall fill. So it gives the sense that it is filling in with more speckles. I'm going to go back, bring out some of the lighter colors. I just wanted to bring back that lighter spot in the middle, so I just took a sample from this one and brought it into that area. But if I'm doing a comparison from the original already, we can see how pale the original ones were, and now how much better with these additional spots to kind of fill out the overall areas of these cookies. So now it's time to clean up some areas around our cookies. It's going to be a little tedious process, but looking to eliminate out some cookies, I'm going to use the lasso tool to draw around the area of the cookie that I do not want. And it's not going to be perfect, but we're going to look to slowly shrink this area down so it's no longer part of the cookies that we have around it. With this area drawn out, I'm going to go up to Edit, Fill, and I'm going to change to Content Aware. Everybody has their own preference of how their Content Aware works or what Content Aware fill you're using. For me, this works very quickly, does a great job overall. A couple little areas that I still want to tweak, so I'm just going to redraw over the areas again. If I mess up, I can just always click and drag, redraw around the area. And again, every time I do this, it just makes this selection smaller and smaller. We also have this bottom tab, this bottom contextual taskbar. I click on the fill here, content aware. Again, just looking to strike it down a little bit more. So you can see every time it just gets a little bit smaller till we eventually take it out. So now when I deselect, that now looks like it's part of the cookie. I still have this little darker shadow I don't like, so I'm going to draw around this area black. And again, just back down to our little paint bucket icon. It takes out that darker element that I don't want to see. So now looking to eliminate out these bigger elements of cookies, I'm going to again use my lasso tool. And we want to go a little bit outside of the object so it's not trying to produce some of the brown from the cookie itself. But I can actually hold down Shift to add in multiple selections. So I'm going to try to eliminate a number of the cookies that we see in this foreground area. And even these crumbs in the foreground, I'll try to do my best to get them out now, but likely they'll need some touching up in a moment. So once these areas are drawn out, again, back to the paint bucket at the bottom of the taskbar, content aware fill. Give it a moment, and Photoshop does its own magic and saves you a lot of trouble of editing. If I deselect, yes, there's still areas of cleaning up that we need to do. I go over to the left side navigation. I'm going to change my healing brush over to the spot healing brush. With the spot healing brush, I can go over top of a crumb, and Photoshop does a great job of recognizing it and eliminating out a number of specks. Make sure not to go necessarily too large with the area that you're trying to erase, but if I click and drag over an area, I usually can get a number of little imperfections, flaws eliminated from the selection. Be careful not to go too large with the brush either. If I do go over an area, yes, it might work, or it might leave up a couple little splotches. You just want to be careful not to go too large as you get closer to the objects. If I go too large over a larger, too much area, it may end up replacing or might not be doing anything to help you out with the design. So just be patient with me as I go through, but hopefully you can follow along as well. I'm not going to get every little speck, but you can get the right idea. Just draws a lot better attention to the main cookies that we have without all these little specks interfering or being a distraction. I'm going to get a couple more samples. So again, just doing another test, seeing the difference before and after. See a lot more cleaned up. Has some area that we can trim down on. I am going to look to probably put a cup of milk or something, or a glass of milk to go with this as well. But what we're going to take a look now is adding in some cookies into the barrel, the top area here. First, I want to get a selected area that we can focus on to restrain and keep all of our cookies in. Over on the left side navigation, I'm going to click on the elliptical marquee tool, second tool, left side navigation. And I click and drag to try fitting to the space that I have here. If I do want to tweak or transform a selection, I can right click and hit transform selection. Then look to modify out the space. You can hold shift to try distorting the shape or rotating it slightly to get a better angle. Big thing here is I particularly want to get is making sure that the bottom where the barrel is lines up how I want. There we go. So with this area selected, I'm just going to hit enter for right now. I see the dotted line. What I can look to do is either make a copy of this area, Control C, Control V. Copies the selection, or I can fill it in for a moment. Eventually it will be hidden, but it will be used as a way to make sure that the cookies that we have stay restrained with inside of the bucket. So for right now, just doing Control C, Control V. You can see that I do have this at the top of my layers, but being just a copy of the interior of the barrel. So next we're going to look to select out the cookies. With the cookies, again, I'm going to use the quick selection tool. The quick selection tool, I could do one cookie at a time. Make sure that you are on the copy background so you can select the cookie that you want. Click and drag in that cookie, Control C, Control V. And I can click and drag, move this cookie up to the area. Right now you can see that it is being blocked by this container, so I'm going to move it above the container opening. Grab another couple cookies. Quick selection tool is a good cookie, it has good details, variation on the cookie. And I click and drag inside of it. If I want to deselect an area, just hold down Alt or Option. I can click and drag in the areas that I don't want to keep. Now that I have that, Control C, Control V, or Command C, Command V, depending on Mac PC. Again, just moving this cookie up for right now. We can also look to get some stack cookies, so that's not just a fake shadow effect, but we can use realistic shadows. Just make sure that you go back to the correct layer so that it gets the selection how you want. So again, Command C, Command V. I'll get a couple more cookies. So now it's just a matter of arranging how these cookies might appear for you. Just think about how it can show some shadows, some variation. Realistic shadows allow us to get a little bit better perspective on it. And I might want to scale down pieces. I can hit Command or Control T. Reduce them a little bit smaller so it fills out the space. I like some of the cookies, but I don't like the others, I can always use the selection tool or the quick selection tool. And just backspace, cut it out. And just make sure to erase out the excess, look for the little details that you might have missed. But again, as I mentioned before, we created that selection of the container, or we made that selection of the container. Now I'm going to go back to that container layer. I'm going to hold down Control or Command on my keyboard. It makes a selection around this area. And the reason why I did this, I'm going to first look to merge the cookies that I have excess versions of. I'm going to merge into one single layer. Right now, this is just my layer 4 and layer 5. I'm going to merge layers so that they become one. But with this selection that I have, I'm going to add a layer mask onto our cookie layer, and it eliminates out the excess cookie that's around it. I didn't technically erase it because I'm using a layer mask to protect the cookies. But if I disable the layer mask, still have the cookies, but I'm going to right click on the layer mask again, just enable, so we can see that the cookies are inside of the container. I can also consider getting into darkening up some of the areas on the container. So I'm going to go over to my burn tool, left side navigation, make my brush a lot bigger. I'm going to switch my section to highlights. I'm just looking to darken the interior of this container, give it more, a little bit around this. And maybe produce a couple little shadows to make it appear as if the cookies are creating a shadow inside the container. The last step for creating out this look for today, we're going to look to add in a cup of milk. For the cup of milk, I found a random image off the internet, but I can click and drag it into the picture. I'm going to get into scaling it. First, I don't like the perspective. I want the shadow to be casting on the right side. So I'm going to make sure to reflect it over, flip horizontal. I can right click on the image, flip horizontal. I'm going to hide it behind the cookies over on the left side here. Right now the cookies down the bottom are appearing behind it, but we want to make them appear in front. So I'm going to use, again, the quick selection tool to select on the cookies. Gets the selection around the area, but we're going to go back over to our cup of milk. And with a layer mask, yes, it makes the entire milk disappear. Actually, save yourself the problem. I selected on the cookie, but I want to invert my selection so I focus on my milk. So I'm going to invert the selection on this bottom taskbar, clicking on the invert selection. Now when I add a layer mask onto this layer, it cuts out the area of the milk that's behind the cookie. And I can look to touch up some areas if I just want to tweak or modify. I'm going to go over to the paintbrush, brush tool, left side navigation, and I have a white fill. And clean up these little white red areas that I'm seeing to make sure that it looks like the milk is just right behind without any gap in between. It's not perfect, but looks a lot more professional in how it might be presented. Now we have to start thinking about the shadow. We can see that the container of the cookies creates a shadow against the wall behind it. The cookies underneath of the object show a shadow. Now we're going to put a shadow in for our cup of milk. To make this shadow, we're going to create a new layer. We call it milk shadow, or glass of milk shadow. We're going to go over to the either polygon lasso tool, or my preference is using the pen tool. With the pen tool, I'm going to look to draw out a shadow that casts from behind the object, so we're not really going to see the first portion of it. But it does go back slightly to the right, and because of our glass of milk, it does go upwards and vertical pretty high. And I'm going to look to add in this kind of rounded rim. I'm going to click and drag. And one thing I forgot to mention, make sure that for your pen tool, you're drawing with the path, not the shape. Path will give us the ability to get the selection. Shape will draw out lines that kind of interfere and don't necessarily recognize to the shape that we're looking for. But now I'm going to go over to where it intersects with or touches the table. Again, click a point. If I want to cut off this anchor point, I can hit Command Z to undo, or Control Z to undo. I'm going to hold down Option to cut off this anchor point. I can go down to where it intersects with the table, and then down to the front corner of our cup. And again, we're going to round out slightly just so I get a shadow down at this bottom portion, and connect over to where we started. So we can see the selection around for the cup area. We're going to click on Selection at the top navigation. Click OK. So we get that dotted line appearing around the area for a shadow. Now we're going to fill in the shadow with the gradient tool. This will give us more of a faded effect. I have a black gradient that you can see in the top navigation here. If I want to adjust this gradient in any way, I can click on the sample, modify the color. I don't like that dark gray. I'm going to go more true black. And click OK. And you can see how it's casting on the back wall for the cookies. Now we're going to do that same idea for this area with the gradient tool. I'm going to start at the bottom area, click and drag upward so that the black is casting back. I want it a little bit higher overall, so I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to make sure that's on a linear gradient. I'm not necessarily going to have it go all the way up, but enough that it does appear a little bit darker on the back wall. I'm going to deselect. Right now it doesn't match very well, it doesn't look realistic. But what we are going to do is drop this behind our milk. Right now the shadow is appearing from our glass or from the area selected that we made. What I'm going to do is create a selection around the layer mask that we have for the thumbnail of the glass. I can hold down Control, click on the little white box, and we see that selection now placed around our cookie area. With the glass layer shadow selected, I add a layer mask. and it cuts off that shadow that's sitting underneath on that bottom portion. But now we want to get into modifying the shadow. I'm going to select back on the actual thumbnail of our shadow. We're going to go up to select at the top navigation. Actually, we're going to over to filter. With filter, we're going to go down to blur, and we're actually going to go into the blur gallery. Blur gallery gives us a number of different types of shadows, but more specifically for the one that we're going to do a field shadow where we can apply different blurs within one selection. For this, I'm going to pin a couple shadows, one in the middle, or one in the bottom, one in the middle, and probably two on the top, just to give me a different variation. The idea of this is that when we do pin this, I can get into modifying out these gradients. You see these little white bars allows us to adjust the amount of blur that we see over on a certain area. I'm going to slide this a little bit higher so we blur this area out a little bit stronger. Over on the right side, this is a little bit lower. As I drag up, it starts to blur this area out more. You can see as I let go, I have a low blur, we get that sharp edge. But if I adjust this blur higher, we get what looks like more similar to the shadow casting off the object over on the container. Down on this bottom middle one, again, just not enough blur to it. I'm going to push this up. And then down on this bottom side, it does have a little bit of blur. I'm just going to push up a little bit more so it's a little bit softer. And this idea gives us the ability to fade out to the background. So finally, our last element. So once I have this, I can click OK at the top navigation. Right now, this shadow doesn't really sit well or look realistic in comparison to this shadow. So I'm going to take a look at my blend modes first and see how it applies. If I go over top, I can see if it will modify this black, reduce down the amount of black, and match better to the red background. And we're really going to see that when we get down to the overlay section or the soft light. You can see how it creates more of a realistic shadow against the back wall. So in comparison, the standard shadow, very black, doesn't really match very well. But going down to overlay or going down to soft light, you can pick and choose which one works for you. I think overlay works well for me. Gets that darker shadow. One little aspect I am going to erase on the layer mask is just over top of this cookie, so it doesn't affect the cookie color itself. Finally, last step I might consider doing is just modifying out the frame. I'm just going to use the crop tool, fifth tool, left side navigation, cut down the area so I focus on my subject. I'm going to hit enter, and there you go. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you can take away something from this edit. Have a good day.